So it's a very great honour and privilege to have a chance to talk to Sir Aaron Klug. How would you like me to address you, if I have to address you? As Aaron, or?
Aaron. I'm known as Aaron in the lab.
Is that all right?
I was on first name terms ever since Max Perutz.
Okay.
When one of the younger people in the lab, the assistants, kept calling him Dr. Perutz, he said, well, if you go on like that, I shall have to call you Mrs. Hay instead of her first name.
Lovely. Well, I would start with where and when you were born.
Yes. I was born in Lithuania in 1926. My father's father was actually a cattle dealer, and he had a farm. It's very unusual for Jews to possess land, because it was forbidden under the old Tsarist regime, but this was Lithuania. And so what he did was to buy up cattle from the small peasants and then take them to market. And my father was sent to the big town, to Kaunas, to be trained as a saddler. He was trained as a saddler. But then his father got him to help in the business. So my father was involved in cattle dealing and so on. But he realized there was not much of a future in Lithuania, and quite a number of Lithuanian Jews had moved to South Africa. It's a small Jewish community.
Sidney Brenner's family was another one.
He's from Ukraine, yes.
From Ukraine.
Well, I'm not, that's what he says, but I think he's from part of those border areas, but I think he is, it's the same sort of culture, yes. And so my family moved, my father moved in 1929 because my mother's family had emigrated members of my mother had emigrated to South Africa at the turn of the century, 1900. And they established, their family name was Gevisser.
How do you spell that?
Gevisser.
Yeah.
And they had established a business dealing in sort of primary material in Durban, South Africa. And so that's where we went. I remember nothing of it, of course. But I must have learnt English pretty early on. And I have an elder brother who's a few years older than me, 21 months older than me. And so we moved. And so my father was employed in the Gevisser. Michel Gevisser was the name of the company. And they dealt in primary products, because my father knew something about leather, being a saddler. So he was involved in buying hides and things of that sort. He was a sort of hide merchant working for Michel Gevisser. And then and so that's how he came. He went early, as was tradition. He went ahead of the family, and after he'd found a place to live and so on, the rest of the family came out. So he went first pretty soon after my birth. I had an elder brother, as I said, and so then the family followed, and we got to Durban around about 1929. I was 2.5 or something of that sort. I remember nothing of it, of course. And so he went on working for them, and we had no other family in Durban, although my father's brother immigrated to Johannesburg some years later. So I did have cousins, Klug cousins in Johannesburg. That figures later in the story. So I went to...
Tell me something about the character of your father, I mean, as a person. And
my father, well, he was very much concerned with making well, making a good living.
And if
like
you tell it to me.
he was making a good living, and he was regarded. He had been regarded as clever, but he never had much of an education, you see, other than because he had a standard Jewish education. And after he retired, he would go to. He had a curiosity because he would always go to. In Hebrew, it's Gemara Shiurs. These are lessons. He would go to the synagogue. He was just an ordinary observant Jew, but he was interested in Talmud, and he never had the full education to go through Talmud. And so he would, later on in life, when he had more time and semi-retired, he would go to these lessons once a week, where you studied various sections of the Talmud. And so I remember when I got married in England. So when we went to England, he wrote me a letter quoting. The idea was that you would quote some parable or something or some extract, and he sent some letters like that. But he was concerned mostly with getting on in the world and making sure that we were all right. So I went to primary school.
And your mother?
My mother died when I was about 6 years old. Of those days of pneumonia, and my mother's younger sister had come with us, and I don't know what happened, but she had helped bring us up, you see, the two of us. And so some years later, after my mother died, my aunt, as she was, had been much courted. She was a good-looking woman, and she married my father. And I don't know what went on, but I'm told that the older cousin, one of the Gavissa cousin, the older member of the family, said it was her duty to marry my father and help bring us up the two boys. Now I don't know what happened, but they got married. I was about 7 or 8 years old. So and so she just continued. We used to call her aunt, which was until some years later. My brother and I realized she was actually our mother. It took some years, and she didn't object to it, so we began to call her Mum. And that was I found it difficult to call her Mum.
Was she a warm
Yes, she was.
person?
She was. She was quite. Well, she'd always been around, you see, so she was a second mother anyway, and so on. So that was she was my Aunt Rose was her name, so she became Mum. Now I went to a primary school. It was interesting in Durban. We lived in a house near a bush. Durban was a relatively small town, had a white population of 100,000, very English, settled almost entirely by English, so that the people I went to school with, their parents still called England home, you see, which was typical of the Natal English. The big settlement in Natal, there'd been one in the 1870s, but there'd always been people coming to Natal. And if you know some South African history, you know, but you know that the English conquered Natal from the Dutch, from the Boers, 1842 and things like that. So in 1870 there was an immigration into Durban. And so it was a very English town. In fact, when I came we went on our first holiday in England, and we went to, where was it, to Swanage or somewhere, and the beach huts, and in Durban, which is a beautiful subtropical climate, the beach huts on the beach where the people would sit were carved, and they had sides to stop the wind, but there was no wind. You see, they were copied exactly from England, and the post boxes were exactly in England, you see. And so England was, and I say England, we didn't call it Britain in those days. It was and I knew pretty well. I knew roughly what the map of London was. And when I came to, my wife says, when I came to England as a student, I knew exactly where I was. And that was a bit later, and it was very. And so at school, then I went to high school, Durban High School, and the philosophy of Durban High School, it was founded in 1875, and it was very simple. If you were bright at high school, you went into the Latin class, and it had been Latin and Greek, but Greek had been abandoned because we had to do Afrikaans as a second language. So if you were bright, you went into the science class. As if you went to a Latin class, you had no choice. And if you're not so bright, I don't know how they sorted them, because there was a little movement between classes. And on the whole, it was fixed when you came. You went into the science, and if you were in the third category, you had to make do with geography or things like that. So that was the curriculum. Well, I was very good at school. I always came first in the tri-weeklies. My brother always came second. We were in the same class. He's 2 years older than me, and it wasn't. None of us realized it was really we should never have been in the same class. But what happened is that he started out ahead of me, but they had the business of jumping. I was 2 years behind. I was putting you up, and it was quite easy to accommodate. But it was a great help, because I was, he was pretty bright too, you see. And so, but he was older than me, so he was a sort of protector in a sense. So that was the Durban High School.
But you were very bright, so you got into the classics stream, did you?
Well, it was Latin.
Latin, yeah.
Yes, in the Latin stream. But we did do science. We did do one subject, science. The science class did full physics and full chemistry. That was it. And I was pretty good at Latin. And we used to, with some of us who were, 5 or 6 of us who sailed through the Latin, he invented some extra lessons for us. So we had to try to write, we write Latin composition. You know, we had to read Cicero's speeches and try to write little essays on that style. It was quite rigorous. It was before they went down, so I enjoyed that.
You were obviously a good linguist, because you had Afrikaans,
yes,
Latin, English, and Hebrew.
My brother and I went to Hebrew classes. Now, in Afrikaans, I was pretty fluent in Afrikaans. In fact, I got a distinction in what's called the Hoër Taalbond. Taal is language in Dutch, bond, and the Hoër is the higher language, so you could get a qualification in Afrikaans. I read quite a lot of Afrikaans literature. Hebrew, I really wasn't all that. I knew I could read biblical Hebrew. I wasn't very good at modern Hebrew. And but when I mentioned coins, later when I began collecting coins, Greek and Roman coins, I could read the Greek, of course, from the Greek alphabet and so on. I had a dictionary. The Hebrew coins, which were during the Seleucids and the Maccabees at the time of independence, although their Hebrew script had changed, they were written in the ancient script, which is Phoenician. So I learned that and so on. So I enjoyed languages. Later on, when I forgot my Latin, but then when one of my sons started doing Latin at school here in England, I decided I'd better brush up my Latin. I thought I would just see it. So I got hold of interlingua text. Have you ever seen these? Well, you get the Bible that way. You can get concordances. So what happens is that the you have a text. You can get a Greek text or a Hebrew, I think, and underneath is the translation, word for word. Now, what happened? So I decided I'm going to read Caesar's Civil War again, which I knew pretty well at school. This was quite a while older. And as I began reading it, it looked all wrong. And I realized what had happened. This was an American. This was done from the John Dewey. You know, he was the famous educationist. I got it from a book still at Columbia University where I've been visiting. And they had changed the Latin word order so that the English would be continuous. So in disgust I threw it away. So I never so
You're obviously a very studious person to do so well in all these things, but did you have any hobbies or?
Oh yes, sport. Well, the main thing, the thing that mattered most at Durban High School was sport. So we had sport in the afternoons, 4 times a week. We had a school team, and there was practice, and there was a
cricket, of course.
Cricket, yes, cricket. Well, right. Well, the same. We had rugby.
Rugby.
We had practice, and so we always had. And we had cadets on the 5th day, old-fashioned cadets. So that was kept you busy.
Were you good at any of these sports?
No, not very. No. I discovered my brother was a good cricketer, and he was a left-hander, very good bat. So, but I wasn't, because I discovered later why. It turned out that particularly in tennis, I could never hit a backhand. And later, when I came to have my South African Army test, when you turn 17, ready for 18, you had to have a South African Army. The war was on. I'll explain that later. And I discovered they thought I was blind in my right eye. Well, what happens? I discovered they have an optic atrophy, so I only have central vision, so I can't see anything. And this explained why. When I was on my bike, I couldn't see people passing on the right side. I never noticed it wasn't a handicap until, but they thought I was blind, and so so what happened? I had an atrophy of all the peripheral of the optic, so that was so I wasn't. But I wasn't a natural sportsman anyway, my brother was. So.
And what about music and things like that?
Music. Well, my brother was very keen on music, so we listened to records. And I was introduced gradually. We didn't have any instruments at home, because we had the radio, we listened a lot to the radio. And there were sections, there were classic sections and so on. So I began, when I was still at school in the last few years, to listen to serious music on either records or on the radio. And by serious music I mean Beethoven's violin concerto, or piano concerto, and things like that. But I'm not musical though, and I couldn't sing it. In primary school, I couldn't sing in tune, because I haven't got so that was...
But do you listen to music much now, or...?
I do a bit. My wife does. My wife's very musical. She was a good pianist, and so I listen to that. But we don't go much to concerts and so on. We used to go when we lived in London. We would sometimes go to Albert Hall and places like that. I enjoy it. I enjoy the obvious classics, so to speak. And my wife she was very experimental. She ran, this is my wife, we'll come to that later, she ran the Cambridge University dance group, it was modern dance, and so I remember she was trying out Stockhausen and people like that, and electronic music, but I didn't care for that. I just have the standard classics, you see. So I wouldn't say I'm not musical.
Was there often a person's academic life is deeply influenced by one or two teachers or companions at school? Was there anyone who taught you, who inspired you particularly?
No, I was good at all subjects. And I did, one time when I was at school, I became fascinated by Egyptology. I mean, I read a good deal. I read classic books on Egypt, and so I tried to teach myself hieroglyphics. I did get a little distance, and I became interested. And I followed up. I know a good deal about the origins of the alphabet. Followed through on the different, and from pictorial writing thing. I've always read that. But when I was at school, I read a book by Paul de Croo called Microbe Hunters. And it turned out this has influenced many people I've come across. Paul de Croo was a Dutch science writer, and the book called Microbe Hunters. And in it told the stories of Pasteur and Koch. So I thought, well, maybe I should become a microbiologist. There's a romance, you see. And you know the stories of Pasteur and rabies and Koch and so on. And so I decided I would do medicine. I was 15 years old when I went to university, which wasn't so, because I'd been 2 years ahead, you see. And so was Sidney Brenner.
So yes, I was going to say it's the same.
Well, he grew up on the Rand in Jameson and Johannesburg. And I met him. I'll tell you about it later. And so there was no medical school in Durban or Pietermaritzburg, the capital. And so I went to the Witwatersrand as a medical student, and I found this. And I sailed through my first year. I went into second year. The first year were the standard pre-medical subjects. It's different from the botany.
Your parents were well enough off to finance all this, were they?
Well, yes, I stayed. I was a rather young 15. I didn't want me living in residence, so I stayed in the house of my father's brother who'd emigrated to Johannesburg. So I lived with a family there. I didn't go to, I wasn't at one of the boarding houses. And I won a scholarship, so I didn't have any fees. And as for my keep, my father was able to, it was very cheap living, for white South, it was very cheap living because we had cheap labor. And so I went there, and after, in my second year, I started doing anatomy, physiology, and physiological chemistry, as back then it was called then. Those were the standard subjects in the second year. And I found that, I quite found that dissecting anatomy, you dissect the cadavers. There's 6 of you around the table around the cadaver with a smell of formalin. I quite enjoyed that. I marveled at the maxilla where the nerves and the blood vessels go through, and how on earth do you do all this? You're articulating it. The vessels, you don't have your blood supply. So it was quite an eye-opener. But in the end I got bored with it, and I found the physiology and the biochemistry much more interesting. And I decided that by this time that I really should learn some chemistry. So I decided to give up medicine, and I went to the dean. I had a good academic record, you see, and I said, I'd like to do another course. And I more or less designed my own curriculum. I didn't know that I was doing it, but there was a very good dean of science called Van der Horst, a zoologist. And he said, well, we'll arrange it. So I did a combination of subjects. It took me a year later, which had never been done before in the university. I had to get a special bill from the Senate or something, I didn't know this was going on, but this is what Van der Horst went on. And so I started doing chemistry, and I decided I spent half my time in the medical school doing physiology, and I went on with histology, having given up anatomy. I found histology at the cellular level pretty interesting. So I went on with that, and I did. So I did, and I just decided I must have found out something about physics and maths. And I heard a talk about the Schrödinger wave equation, and I thought, well, I have to understand this wave equation. How can matter be particles and waves? And so I started doing physics and maths. So I did a 4-year course instead of a 3-year course, and I passed the exams in physiology, chemistry, physics, and maths, and I got first in everything. I was pretty good at it, and then I decided, what am I going to do next?
Were there, again, asking about teachers, were there any inspiring lecturers?
No,
Or
there was a there was a man who gave a talk, a popular talk, on a man called Arthur Blexley, on the wave equation, on Schrödinger's wave equation, and that's what inspired me. And I said, I can't go to my grave not understanding this. I had an intellectual curiosity. That's what it comes down to. I wouldn't have described at the time, looking back on it. And I found everything interesting. I always read history and not much of geography. I started reading quite a lot. Well, I'd done that in the school, so I went on reading Roman and Greek history and so on, and continue to do so. So where I got inspired was in Cape Town. And I went to Cape Town because they were offering a master's degree in physics. I decided I was going to do physics because that was the biggest. So I went and did a master's degree in physics at Cape Town, and for £20 a month, you could, as long as you taught in the practical classes, and that was enough to live on in those days, £20 in Cape Town. So I lived very, very simply in a room in old slave quarters, Malay slave quarters. And I cooked for myself and everything. And my parents wanted to send money, but I sent it back because I thought I had to be independent. Because they didn't object. You see, being Jewish parents, you might have thought that but they didn't intervene. You know the Jewish joke about my son, the doctor, and all that. You know.
Well, tell me.
Oh, well, they're very proud. The proudest thing a Jewish mother, when her son was the doctor. Later on in the States, when the Jews started going into biochemistry, the joke was made of my son, the biochemist. What's that? So I, at the University of Cape Town.
You were about 20 now, were you? Or?
I was 19. Yes, I went in 46. I turned 20. I turned 20 there. That's right, 15 plus 4, 19. I turned 20 there. And so I did an MSc course, and the professor there was R.W. James. Now he was an inspiration, not so much as as himself, because he wasn't a very inspiring person, but just where he came from. He'd been with Shackleton to the pole, try to get to the pole, had been marooned on Elephant Island. And he told me the story when he was recruited by Shackleton. Shackleton interviewed him. He was a physicist just out of Cambridge. He and Lawrence Bragg, he was the same class as Lawrence Bragg. And Shackleton, interviewing him, asked him, "Can you sing?" Well, he could sing. The reason was in those the winters when they had to spend time in the hut, they had to entertain themselves. That turned out to be, they called Shackleton the boss, you see. He's rather a great character. So James himself was quite interesting. In fact, I did apply to the South African Antarctic Survey but they wouldn't take it because I had glasses on. They would take anybody with glasses. That was also because I was rather restless. And in Cape Town I met my future wife, she was a music student at the University of Cape Town. Then later she went to dance school, to modern dance school. But that was, so Cape Town, I think, University of Cape Town.
What is her name, your wife?
Liebe, L-I-E-B-E. It's the German and the Jewish word for love.
Yes.
The parents were very romantic. And so she was an only child. And so it was so I fell in love, and it was great in Cape Town because it's a beautiful city, a mountain in the backyard, and it was an old city. You see, in Johannesburg and Durban were very new, but Cape Town had, well, there we met artists and so on, people of a wider, just of a wider culture generally. But Johannesburg hardly had anything, and Durban had only the Natal Society for watercolour artists. It was all very provincial, right. Although later on in the Durban Art Gallery there was a painting of T.S. Eliot. I didn't know who he was at the time, but it was by Wyndham Lewis who painted it. It was there. Later on I discovered who he was. But Durban had a good library. When I was at the library, I remember some of the books I read, Ranke's History of the Popes. I read things like that. I knew who Ranke was, so on. I was curious about everything, I think, and I still am curious about almost everything. But I've learned to have to be disciplined and to do things, and so distinguish between hobbies and. Although my main hobby is my work, you see. James had been, and then he worked with Bragg, that's Lawrence Bragg. Yes. And in 1937 he emigrated to Cape Town. Now in those days, Cape Town, you took a chair in Cape Town as you might go to Toronto or Sydney or Nottingham or Sheffield, just part of the empire. Yes. It's still the empire. And so he was Bragg's second man, but Bragg was still relatively young, and there was another man called Taylor who was roughly contemporary of Bragg. Bragg in 1938 moved to Cambridge after Rutherford died, so it's possible that when I came to Cambridge they wanted me to do crystallography, but I started doing crystallography in Cape Town, X-ray crystallography, because that's what James had done. And he had built some X-ray sets for doing X-ray diffraction of crystals, and I did an MSc, which was a good course because the physics and the teaching at WITS, Witwatersrand University in Johannesburg, was pretty poor. So I actually attended all James's third-year courses as well as MSc courses. And he represented to me, the real modern Cambridge tradition. So I knew, and so
it was a 1 or 2 year course.
It was a 2-year course, but I did it in 1 year, and I actually solved the crystal structure of an organic molecule, which wasn't a great feat, but I introduced a new method of doing it. It uses Fourier transforms and so on. And I'd learned mathematics. He didn't know what a Fourier transform was, but in fact he put it into the appendix of his famous book, a standard book he was writing. So and so on the strength of that he thought, well, you better go to Cambridge. I had toyed with the idea of going to do London because the crystal structure I solved was rather unusual, and I taught myself what's called quantum chemistry. So when I came to Cambridge, this has figures later in the story, I came to Cambridge and I wanted to do something unusual in X-ray crystallography. And I had heard of the unit, the MRC unit, doing hemoglobin and myoglobin. I thought this was the thing I'd like to do, something unusual. But I went to see Bragg when I arrived, and Bragg said the unit was full. Now to this day I don't know if that's true, but I believe it wasn't. The reason is that one of my predecessors from Cape Town was a lady called Virginia Martin, who proved to be very clever but hopeless at research. So I think I may have been. Anyway, Bragg said, I said, what? I said, well, what shall I do? He said, well, there was some interesting problem in order disorder in silicates. Now, silicates, although I now find them fascinating, I didn't think so at the time. So I looked around, and I wrote, this is all took away, I was there for, the boat took 2 weeks from Cape Town to, so also when, and there was no airmail, no telephoning. So I, for the first almost 2 months in Cambridge, I didn't have a supervisor.
But you were at Trinity College, is that right?
I went to Trinity, yes.
Yeah.
And I had a tutor, William Hamilton, but he wasn't much help. I originally thought I might do a part 2, but he said, you know enough, go straight into, because there's tradition for people from the colonies or the dominions, because the courses were a year or two, but I'd already done an MSc and I knew enough. I mean, so he quite rightly said, do a PhD. So I think the first 2 months in Cambridge I was looking for a supervisor. In the end I went around the Manchester Mafia. There was Leonard Jones, Professor of Chemistry, there was Hartree, Professor of Mathematical Physics, and so in the end Hartree said he would take me on, and I said, what was the problem? He thought it was a problem left over from the war, he said. What was the problem? During the war, he was a mathematical physicist. He'd done important work in atomic physics, but also had introduced new numerical methods of solving problems you couldn't do analytically. And this was the cooling of steel, which seems very... when you make steel, you quench the iron-carbon mixture, that is, and the iron-carbon goes through a series of phase transformations to turn it into hardened steel. So you quench the ingots, and the practice was to leave them for 9 hours overnight, you see. Well, Hartree thought, well, why 9 hours? So he actually began to introduce, this was Baldwin's in Sheffield. Later I went to Sheffield. So he begot Baldwin's to make a few simple experiments. They made some iron bars, cylindrical iron bars, and they had thermocouples to measure the temperature. And he found that the cooling curve, measuring the cooling as they quenched it, showed that probably the transition was complete in 2 or 3 hours. So they changed the time, and they reduced the time to 3 hours, which increased the output. It made a big difference, and this all the whole steel people did. It was all 19th century practice that continued. The British industry was very much no science in it. German industry was very different, you see. So when I came to Brad Hartree said to me, well, I have a problem which might interest you, left over from the war. He told me about this phase transformation in steel. It undergoes a change in structure. The carbon atoms would sit in between the ions, and so steel is made of iron carbide, rearrange themselves. He said, well, I need somebody who knows a crystallography. So I said, I'll do it. It turned out in the end that I learned a lot of metallurgy. In Cambridge, I went around and spoke to people. I found a lot about metals, and I worked out a model in which the new phase, as the new phase grew, it had to be initiated, go to nucleation, then it had to grow. And so I got the parameters, and I worked out the model, and it could account for it all. It turned out to be very simple, that what governed them was the dissipation. As the steel cools, it goes through a phase transformation, changes from one phase to another, and gives up heat. And it's the dissipation of the heat. So I modeled all this on a computer. In those days, at the beginning of EDSAC, the Cambridge computer. Originally I did it by hand so I was solving partial differential equations in mathematics. I never thought I'd ever be doing that, but that's what I did. So then I got the hell on with the story. So I did my PhD was on phase transformations, but I had a good model, and I never published it. I should have, but I never did. But then I didn't know what I was going to do next, but
Was he a good supervisor? Interesting.
No, he wasn't very good. He was a train addict. He kept lists of trains and train journeys and so on. He was a distinguished mathematical physicist, but he wasn't inspiring at all. And
were there others who inspired you at that time? I mean, during that PhD?
No, but I took part. But I had a great time because I went to part 2, part 3 lectures in mathematics. I learned group theory, things which later stood me in good stead at a later stage. I will explain how. And so I went to a lot of the courses. I just kept educating myself.
And you were married at this time?
I was married, yes. But my wife, we married very young, but my wife went off to live. Well, you see, people didn't live together in those days. You could get married. So we got married just before we came here. She was a student at the US Lader School, who had been in Cambridge during the war. They were German avant-garde, modern dance. And they were, believe it or not, there was Mrs. Roughton. You know about Alice Roughton?
Yes.
Yes, well, she housed them during the war.
Really? This is in Adams Road, is it?
Adams Road, number 9 Adams Road.
That's right.
But it turned out, at the time we got to Cambridge, they had now moved to London. And so that idea we would both go to Cambridge. I'd be a student in Cavendish, and she would be in London. And it didn't work out. So she actually moved to London, and we used to see each other at weekends. She kept us up by teaching in a secondary modern school. So I went to our secondary modern school, teaching dance various things, because she had university education. So this was...
did you have anything more to do with Bragg, either now or later?
Nothing more. Bragg wanted me to work on silicates, so a disappointment to him. I think it's quite interesting, order disorder. I wanted to work on my own problem, which was order disorder in alloys, which I'd read about. He said, no, we've stopped that work now. It was the work that I'd read about. So I didn't go. I don't know, I seem to must have had a lot of... I don't think I was arrogant in any way. I just didn't... It's funny, looking back on it, I must have appeared very strange to him, which I've only now begun to think about.
Because you were so self-confident about what you wanted to do, you mean?
I wasn't self-confident. I don't think I boasted of anything like that. I wanted to do things which I liked, which I was interested in, and not just do a thesis for the sake of it. So but I learned a lot of mathematics, but it stood me in good stead. I'll tell you why. So when I developed this model of a growth nucleation, separating this, making the first initial change, and then this grows, and I developed this model. This later, it was a preparation of things to come. When I worked on the assembly of tobacco mosaic virus, which is where the virus, there's a model on the stairs which you probably haven't seen. It's the RNA and the protein come together. And when I worked on virus structure, which I later, people were trying to understand how the virus assembled, and they used to mix the protein and the RNA. It was self-assembling. I introduced that word, self-assembling. Protein and RNA only, and they waited for 24 hours under the right salt conditions and the buffer. I managed to do it in 2 to 3 hours, because I realized that there must be, this is such a complicated object, you'd have to go through a phase of starting it. It's a helical assembly. I show you the model on the stairs. It's a helical assembly where the units grow in a helix. And the RNA, which is the infectious part of the virus, is inside. So this has to be assembled, and it's not a simple geometrical process. So I realized it has to be started, and I discovered that the protein on its own would make little rings, little discs. And I realized that what must be happening is that the RNA, along with the molecule, was making a contact with the RNA, and this would grow. So I started out, and so in 20 minutes we started the assembly, and in 4 hours it was totally complete. And I got that time down to 2 hours, fact, later on half an hour, when we understood exactly what was happening. So I used the model of nucleation and growth. It was never ever done before. The biochemists called initiation and elongation. And I remember having to explain it to them. They didn't know the word nucleation and growth. It was a physicist's word, biochemist words. As I say, initiation, elongation. And I remember, and I told people, I didn't know I was going to do physical chemistry of proteins. I went around talking about, worked out the structure of the virus, which I did with Rosalind Franklin. I'll come to in a moment. And none of them would take it up. So I did it myself with a student. I did it here. That was the assembly of TMV. And
Tobacco mosaic virus.
yes, that's right. So where are we now?
You're at the end of your PhD and wondering what to do next.
So I spent a year with F.J.W. Roughton, the husband of Alice Roughton, Cambridge, 9 Adams Road.
Yes.
I have a marvelous story about him, because I worked with him, and what I did was solving partial differential equations, which was the mathematics required for the combination of oxygen with hemoglobin. As it enters the cell, the oxygen gets taken up, it's diffusing into the cell, but it's having a chemical reaction. And so you're having a diffusion and chemical reaction at the same time. And it turned out that I could use the mathematics I developed, the computational, the partial differential equations for solving that, and I did it. Roughton was quite impressed, and but I realized that this is I can't make it. Of course, I can't make a career out of this.
Are you going to tell a story about Roughton? Or?
Oh, about Roughton, yes. So afterwards, I continued doing this, and I went to London, and I went back to crystallography in London, to protein crystallography. But I continued doing things for Roughton, and one day I came up to see Roughton. He lived at the top of the house at 9 Adams Road, right at the top, and he had his lunch sent up on a tray. Down in the garden, you could see from the window, there were various students, Mrs. Roughton, Alice Roughton, Dr. Roughton, and she had the sort of communal meals there. And I know if you know her son was Jeffrey Roughton, whom I knew. And then Roughton looked out at Alice Roughton down in the garden. They had a cow as well, she had milk.
Yes.
And he said to me, "That's my wife, you know." I wasn't exactly a friend with her. I said, "Yes, I know." He said, "She should have been Dame of Sark." So
my former professor and head of department lived at 8 Adams Road. This is
yes.
Jack Goody.
Oh yes, yes.
So I got to know 8 Adams Road, and he used to tell me stories of his neighbour.
Oh yes, yes.
Alice.
Well, she ran a kind of open house in Wicked Pattern, and she just dished out the food and so on. But Roughton lived. So that was
You went to London.
I went to London. Then I decided I'd better go back. and go back and do some. I'd done crystallography, and I thought I'd been thwarted in joining the MRC protein, the MRC protein, and Burnell. There was an advertisement for a Nuffield Fellowship at Birkbeck College where Burnell was, and Burnell, of course, is the founder of molecular biology. Great man who inspired everybody. He himself never carried anything through. He was always busy. The next problem seemed much more interesting than the one he was working on. He never finished anything. Amazing man, Burnell.
Tell me something more about him. I knew his son very well, Martin.
Which one? Martin.
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 Yes.
Yes. Well, Burnell was the. So I'll tell you what I came to do, though. I came to work on protein crystallography with a man called Harry Carlisle, whom Burnell had recruited from Dorothy Hodgkin. And
how do you spell his name? Harry
Carlisle, C-A-R-L-I-S-A. And he had worked for Dorothy Hodgkin in Oxford. He was trying to solve a protein by some higgledy-piggledy methods which didn't work. And he said, he made maps of the protein. I said, this is not the way to do it. He said, oh, this is the way. So I worked out the mathematics wanted to explain what he was doing. It was actually nonsense. I can't describe it all. And he said to me, what I can see in these maps, I can see alpha helices, as they're called. They're parts of the typical motifs in brain structure. So I wrote a program by hand, a computer program, because I was rather adept at that. And I said, there's nothing there. So he got fed up with me. And so I was banished. I had my Nuffield Fellowship. And the Nuffield Fellowship went with an assistant. So he took the assistant. I was banished upstairs, left on my own. And next door, in the room upstairs, was Rosalind Franklin. Unbeknown to me, I'd been there for 4 months already. And see, she never came to tea or coffee. She went across the road to the faculty club. We just had tea in the department. And we were right up in the attic of some old buildings which had been harmed during the war. I was in the room next door to her. And I said, what do you do? And she showed me her pictures of tobacco mosaic virus. Where are they? Those are of virus particles. And they didn't have that quality then. And I was fascinated by it. And I said, can you understand those? She said, yes, we have some idea of elliptical diffraction. And she was working out now Watson had worked on that problem after the DNA. And so I was able to explain some effects we would see in X-ray photographs. I wrote a paper with her in 1955. And so she introduced me. She changed my life because she introduced me to an important and difficult problem which might take years. So I had something to get my teeth into. And so in the few years I worked with her from 1955 to 58, she died in 58. She had come from King's College. After she stopped working at the DNA, she took up tobacco mosaic virus, which by now that started in the 30s, 1938, was interrupted by the war. So, and Bernal encouraged it. So we worked, and I just joined her. I had my own fellowship, and I just simply joined her, and so we began working together on it. And she died in 1958.
What was she like as a person?
Well, she was brisk, to the point, and not at all the dragon person that's painted in Jim Watson's book, The Double Helix.
He describes her as rather plain and never wore.
She wasn't plain.
Never wore makeup and.
No, she was quite smartly written. No, she wore makeup. She wore makeup, but he said she could have made herself prettier. You see, he writes about her. So but she was a sort of rationalist, and I mean, one time we needed some space, and I worked with her, and she said, "Well, why can't another on the backside would be much more convenient if we swapped labs with him, so we wouldn't have to keep running up and down stairs. It would suit most people." And she said to me, "Why can't he see?"
He being.
This is a member of staff.
Yeah.
He worked on silicates, calcite. I remember his name in a moment. Then why can't he be simply rational? I said, "Well, Rosalind, don't you see? People don't want to move. It's not a question of we can't find rational solutions to these things." She was, and so she nagged Bernal, but Bernal wouldn't force him to move. And she was, but I had no problems with her. The story was that she couldn't get on with people. I got on with her quite well, because I simply spoke to her as I would, and she treated me as an equal, and she was older than me, and so on. And because she could see that I had some ability. And then she died in 58, and I found myself in charge of the group of 3 people she had got. By the time she had acquired some postdocs and a student, Ken Holmes, John Finch and Ken Holmes, who were both now fellows of the Royal Society. They moved with me to Cambridge when I moved to Cambridge. And so we managed to get a grant from the United States National Institutes of Health, who didn't give foreign grants, except to work that was not being done in the United States, with only people working on virus structure. And after she died in '58, I took up the problem of polio virus structure. She had started it, but she couldn't control the crystals. And I discovered what was wrong with that the crystals were in what's called low salt solution, and the acid in the glass was making them bad. So I introduced a new kind of glass and was able to solve polio in 1959. And I showed Bernal the first X-ray picture of polio virus crystals. And he said to me, this I was rather, he said, this picture is worth £10,000. And I hadn't realized, you see, that Bernal had to keep raising money, because he had all sorts of adventures going on in his lab. Rosalind Franklin was actually hired to work on coals and carbons, not on plant viruses. But Bernal's idea was that you had to do industrial work. There's work going on. Jeffrey was the man I mentioned, he wouldn't move. He was working on on structure of clinker. You know what clinker is?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, well, I didn't know what clinker was in those days. But Bernal thought it might be useful to be able to turn it into something, some kind of cement. And Rosalind worked on graphite. And the money that came in, and there was also work going on flour mill associated. So Bernal was raising money from various sources and financing the pure research on the basis of the applied work that was Bernal. To the RNA, which has of course been opened up to show the RNA on the inside.
So this is the model you made, is it?
I made for the Brussels exhibition of 1958. It was Rosalind and I were invited to make the model by Lawrence Bragg, who was running this. And we made this one. I also made one of polio, which is a spherical one, but that's in the Science Museum. And so these are the individual units self-assembling, and they accommodate the RNA.
When did you make this?
58.
58.
For an international exhibition in Brussels. Rosalind was dying then. She was in hospital with...
And you made it together?
Well, we started off, but I and Ben made it in the end. And Rosalind was unemployed constructed a sculptor to blow up these